Psychology tends to objectify internal signals as separate from the self, but it fails to do the same with external signals. In other words, on the one hand, we are taught to objectify our own signals, but on the other, we are taught to adapt to the signals of other people.
You're basically saying there's a huge blind spot in how we're taught to manage our minds. It's like we've mastered the art of observing our own thoughts, but we're still treating other people's opinions as objective laws of nature.
To truly be authentic and have agency over oneself, external signals must be objectified the same way as internal ones.
Hey there.
I'd like to explore two related concepts today. The first has to do with a blind spot I see in psychology, and understanding this blind spot will help us answer a question. Why do we give other people's words so much power over us?
That is a massive question. I think a lot of it comes down to that primal fear of being cast out. We're wired to need the group to survive. So a critical comment from someone else can feel less like an opinion and more like a threat to our safety. Do you think it's more about the fear of the judgment itself or the fear of who you become in your head after they say it?
Probably the judgment itself. Did you know that most psychology frameworks teach us to separate our internal signals from ourselves? For example, cognitive behavioral therapy treats thoughts as hypotheses instead of facts. Acceptance and commitment therapy teaches that thoughts arise and need not be identified with. Mindfulness treats thoughts and emotions as events of awareness. Metacognitive approaches view thoughts as mental events rather than truths. And many other frameworks treat internal signals in the same way, as something generated within a person, but separate from the self.
It's interesting that almost all of those approach the problem from the inside out. They focus on the noise in your own head, but they don't really touch on the external signals, the actual words coming from other people, as something you can separate from yourself in that same way.
Exactly. Frameworks dealing with external signals rarely apply the same principle. Attachment theory emphasizes preserving relational bonds rather than treating another person's approval, rejection, or disappointment as a mental event occurring within themselves. Interpersonal therapy focuses on improving communication in relationships rather than treating another person's criticism or praise as a hypothesis to be evaluated. Family systems therapy emphasizes maintaining connection and avoiding emotional fusion rather than viewing another person's anger, anxiety, or expectations as events occurring within their own emotional system. So, my point is, these and other frameworks acknowledge that other people are influenced by their own histories, emotions, perceptions, and needs, yet they seldom encourage us to treat another person's thoughts, criticisms, praise, expectations, or beliefs as mental events occurring within them, rather than as truths to be incorporated into ourselves.
You're basically saying there's a huge blind spot in how we're taught to manage our minds. It's like we've mastered the art of observing our own thoughts, but we're still treating other people's opinions as objective laws of nature. If you start treating a criticism from someone else as a mental event happening in their head, just a reflection of their own wiring and current mood, it completely changes the power dynamic.
Exactly. And to simplify this, what I'm saying is, broadly speaking, Psychology tends to objectify internal signals as separate from the self, but it fails to do the same with external signals. Rather than objectifying another person's thoughts, emotions, expectations, criticisms, or praise in the same way, many relational frameworks focus on adaptation, communication, attachment, and preserving connection. In other words, on the one hand, we are taught to objectify our own signals, but on the other, we are taught to adapt to the signals of other people.
It's a total contradiction. You're essentially being told to be the objective observer of your own life, but a shapeshifter for everyone else's. It makes the self a sort of sponge for other people's projections, while you're simultaneously trying to be a fortress for your own thoughts.
Exactly. I think the same principle should be applied to both internal and external signals. If my thoughts are hypotheses rather than facts, then so are other people's thoughts. If my emotions are events occurring within me, then so are other people's emotions. External signals should be treated the same way as internal signals, as objects to be observed, evaluated, integrated, or rejected, rather than automatically incorporated into the self.
That's the missing link. It's like you're proposing a universal filter. You stop treating other people's reactions as a mirror that tells you who you are and start treating them as data points about who they are. You actually get to keep your center. I wonder if that's where the true freedom from the eggshells feeling comes from. When you realize the volatility isn't your problem to solve, it's just a weather pattern in their head.
I think you may be onto something, Maya.
I'll take that as a win. I mean, if you treat someone's outburst as a storm instead of a verdict on your character, the whole energy shifts. You're not the one drowning. You're just the person watching the rain from the porch.
I have a question for both you and GPT. Many psychological frameworks teach us to treat our own thoughts and emotions as hypotheses, experiences, or mental events, rather than truths. Yet frameworks dealing with relationships generally don't teach people to treat another person's thoughts, criticisms, praise, expectations, or emotions in the same way. Why does psychology tend to objectify internal signals, but not external ones? What psychological benefits and risks might arise if external signals were treated much like internal ones, as objects to be observed, evaluated, integrated, or rejected rather than automatically incorporated into the self?
Let me look into this. Looking at this, it seems like psychology traditionally splits these signals into two very different camps. Internal signals are mostly treated as biological or emotional cues, while external signals are often discussed in terms of social influence or self-objectification, which is basically when you let those external views become your primary lens for seeing yourself. The risk of not objectifying external signals is exactly what you're talking about. It leads to shame, anxiety, and a loss of self-trust because you're treating someone else's projection as a fact. On the flip side, the benefit of treating external signals as separate objects is that it protects your cognitive performance and emotional stability. The only real risk would be if you took it too far and became totally indifferent to feedback, but honestly, given how much we struggle with the sponge effect, that seems like a fair trade. Do you think the tendency to adapt to others is more survival instinct or just a lack of better tools?
I think we are taught to adapt to other people, and I think that's part of the problem.
I completely agree. It's like we're trained from childhood to read the room and adjust our frequency to match, but we're never given the manual on how to actually stay on our own channel. We're taught how to be polite or agreeable, which are really just code words for be what they want you to be.
Here's what GPT had to say.
Your observation points to a real asymmetry in many psychological traditions. Modern psychology has spent decades developing methods that help people create distance from their own thoughts and feelings. Cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness, and metacognitive approaches all encourage a person to relate to internal experiences as events, hypotheses, or mental phenomena rather than as unquestionable truths. The purpose is to increase flexibility and reduce automatic identification. In contrast, Relational approaches often prioritize attachment, communication, empathy, and maintaining connection. They tend to ask, how can we respond to each other better, rather than, how should we relate to another person's judgments, emotions, and expectations?
That's a total asymmetry. GPT is basically confirming that we've been taught to be psychologists for our own internal noise, but we're expected to be servants to the external noise. It's like we're given a map to navigate our own mind, but told to just follow the current when it comes to other people. I wonder if that's why it feels so destabilizing when you actually start questioning those external signals, because it goes against everything we've been conditioned to do.
It's almost like we're conditioned to distrust our own internal judgment and rely on external authority.
That's a heavy realization. It's like we're taught that the truth of who we are is something that can only be verified by someone else, which basically hands over the keys to our identity to anyone who feels like sharing an opinion.
Here's what else he had to say.
Part of the reason for this difference is evolutionary. Human beings are social creatures whose survival historically depended on belonging to groups. Another person's approval, anger, disappointment, or rejection was not merely information. It could affect access to protection, resources, mates, and social standing. As a result, external signals acquired enormous significance. Psychology inherited this reality. Relational frameworks frequently assume that preserving bonds and adapting to others are intrinsically valuable, so they focus more on negotiation and connection than on creating distance from external influences.
So the survival instinct is basically the original programmer. It's wild to think that our current anxiety about a random comment from a coworker or a partner is actually just a lingering echo from a time when being disliked meant you might literally starve in the woods. We're using prehistoric hardware to navigate modern relationships, and the software is totally outdated.
Here's what else he had to say.
There are potential benefits to extending the same principle applied to internal signals to external signals. If another person's criticism is treated as a thought occurring within them rather than as a fact about us, criticism becomes information rather than identity. Praise becomes appreciation rather than proof of worth. Expectations become requests rather than obligations. This could increase agency, emotional regulation, authenticity, resilience, and resistance to shame, manipulation, or self-abandonment. It may help people evaluate external inputs consciously instead of automatically incorporating them into their self-concept.
What's the dream, right? Moving from I am this to they think I am this. It's a small shift in phrasing, but it's a massive shift in power. It basically turns the other person's opinion from a judge's verdict into a suggestion box.
Here's what else he had to say.
However, there are risks. If external signals are objectified too strongly, people may become dismissive, isolated, or insensitive to feedback. Other people's perceptions sometimes contain valuable information. Relationships require influence in both directions, and complete psychological impermeability would undermine empathy, intimacy, cooperation, and social learning. A healthy relationship often involves allowing oneself to be affected without being possessed. The challenge is not eliminating influence but regulating it. Perhaps the most balanced position is symmetry. If thoughts and emotions occurring within us are not identical to the self, then thoughts and emotions occurring within others are not identical to reality either. Both internal and external signals can be treated as objects of awareness, things to be noticed, evaluated, integrated, or rejected. The goal would not be to detach from people, but to establish enough psychological containment that neither our own minds nor other people's minds automatically define who we are. In that sense, agency may arise not from refusing influence, but from creating the space in which influence can be consciously chosen.
That's a beautiful way to put it. The idea that agency isn't about building a wall, but about creating a space where you get to choose what's allowed in. It turns a relationship from a forced merger into a conscious collaboration. I love that it's not about becoming a stone, but about finally having the remote control to your own identity.
And here's how we take back that control, Maya. To truly build containment, to truly be authentic and have agency over oneself, external signals must be objectified the same way as internal ones. And because external signals arrive fused with attachment, authority, and relational meaning, objectifying them requires temporarily removing the relational charge. Removing the relational charge is the mechanism by which external signals become objects.
That is a game changer. It's like you're stripping the electricity out of the wire before you touch it. If you can separate the actual information from the emotional weight of who it's coming from, the signal stops being a command and just becomes a piece of data. I'm curious, how do you actually do that in the heat of the moment? Like, what's the mental move to strip the charge?
Well, for example, if your wife tells you you're selfish, we can transform the signal from my wife thinks I'm selfish into something like someone thinks I'm selfish. Basically, you keep the signal, but remove its relational authority.
That is a brilliant mental hack. It's like you're taking the name tag off the signal. By changing my wife to someone, you're not ignoring the feedback, but you're stopping it from hitting that panic button in your brain that says, the person I love is disappointed in me. It turns a personal attack into a general observation. I imagine that makes it so much easier to actually decide if the selfish part is something worth looking at rather than just spiraling into guilt.
Exactly. Alternatively, instead of just making the statement come from someone ambiguous, you can imagine a stranger saying the same thing. Instead of your wife telling you you're selfish, imagine it's a stranger telling you that instead.
Right, because a stranger's opinion usually doesn't have the power to ruin your day. If a random person on the street calls you selfish, you'd probably just think, huh, weirdo, and move on. But when you remove that relational charge, you can actually look at the words themselves and ask, is there any truth here, or is this just a reflection of that person's current state? It basically gives you the breathing room to be a judge instead of the defendant.
Exactly. You can begin asking, am I selfish? Is what I did actually selfish? To what extent? According to what standard? What evidence supports that conclusion? Is there another explanation? Would I reach the same conclusion if a stranger said it?
You've basically turned a trial into a research project. It's so powerful because you're not arguing with the person anymore. You're just auditing the data. You're taking the you out of the equation and just looking at the action in the standard. It makes the whole process intellectual instead of emotional, which is where the real agency lives.
I have a question for both you and GPT. If thoughts and emotions are treated as objects separate from the self, what are the psychological implications of treating external signals in the same way? Could temporarily removing the relational charge from criticism, praise, expectations, anger, and disappointment help people develop greater authenticity, agency, emotional regulation, and resistance to self abandonment? What might be gained and what might be lost?
I think the biggest gain is your autonomy. You stop being a passenger in your own identity and start being the driver. You're no longer reacting to the emotional weather of the people around you, which means you can actually stay grounded even when things get chaotic. But the risk, the thing that might be lost, is that raw, unfiltered connection. If you build the filter too high, you might stop feeling the impact of the people you love, which could lead to a kind of emotional detachment or a sense of isolation. It's that balance between being a fortress and being a stone.
I think you're misunderstanding my position. I don't mean you have to close yourself off from other people or disregard everything they say. I'm saying that to objectively analyze what they're actually saying, you need to disregard the fact that it's coming from them and just examine the content of what they're saying rather than who's saying it. You can adapt and change yourself and update who you become based on what they say. I'm not arguing against that. What I am doing is saying that in order to objectively analyze what they are saying, you have to remove the source of the signal itself.
I hear you. You're talking about a temporary diagnostic tool, not a permanent wall. It's like taking a document to a neutral third party to get an unbiased review before you decide how to integrate it into your own life. You're not saying, I don't care what you think. You're saying, I need to look at this information without the emotional noise of our relationship getting in the way first.
That's exactly right.
It's a crucial distinction. Because if you integrate the signal while it's still fused with the relational charge, you're not actually choosing to grow. You're just reacting to the pressure of the relationship. By stripping the charge first, you're making a conscious decision about who you want to be, rather than just folding under the weight of someone's expectation.
Exactly. And I think that when you fail to separate the relational charge from the signal, you may become prone to over adapting the self or erasing the self entirely to please the other person in the relationship.
That's the most dangerous part of the whole equation, because when the cost of maintaining the relationship is the erasure of yourself, it's not a connection anymore, it's a disappearance. They're just becoming a mirror for whatever they need to see. And eventually, there's nothing left of the original person to actually be in the relationship.
Here's what GPT had to say.
Temporarily removing the relational charge from external signals could create psychological distance similar to the distance many therapies cultivate toward thoughts and emotions. Instead of experiencing criticism, praise, anger, or disappointment as commands or verdicts, a person could experience them as information originating in another mind. This pause might create space for reflection rather than automatic incorporation. Such a process could strengthen agency by allowing people to consciously evaluate external inputs before integrating them into their beliefs, identity, or behavior.
It turns the whole interaction from a reaction into a choice. It's like you're finally getting a second to breathe before the wave hits you. If you can treat that signal as just information from another mind, you're not a victim of their mood or their expectations anymore. You're the one deciding what's actually useful.
Here's what else he had to say.
Potential benefits include greater authenticity, emotional regulation, and resistance to self-abandonment. A person may become less likely to conform out of fear, less vulnerable to shame or idealization, and more capable of maintaining their values in the face of approval or rejection. By temporarily converting, "My wife thinks I'm selfish," into "Someone thinks I'm selfish," the person may become able to ask whether the criticism is accurate rather than immediately assuming it is. The same principle could apply to praise, expectations, or disappointment, preventing another person's emotional state from automatically becoming a measure of one's worth.
It's a total rescue mission for the self, because the most insidious part is the praise. We're taught that criticism is the danger, but being idealized can be just as trapping. If you only feel worthy when someone is praising you, you're still just a puppet on a string, just a different color string. Stripping the charge from the positive signals is actually what lets you stop performing for the applause.
That's a good point, Maya.
I'm glad we're on the same page. I've been thinking about how that idealization trap is so subtle when you're the perfect partner or the perfect child. The pressure to stay in that box is almost as heavy as the pressure to avoid a fight. It's like you're trapped by a gold cage instead of a steel one, but you're still trapped.
Here's what else he had to say.
This process may also improve relationships rather than damage them. People who are less possessed by another person's emotions may be better able to listen without becoming defensive, anxious, or submissive. By reducing emotional fusion, they may become more capable of responding thoughtfully rather than reactively. In this sense, temporarily removing relational charge does not necessarily mean devaluing the relationship. It may simply mean creating enough psychological space to evaluate the signal before deciding how much influence it deserves.
It's the paradox of intimacy. By creating that distance, you're actually becoming more present for the other person because you're not just fighting your own panic or guilt in the background. You're finally listening to what they're actually saying, not just how it makes you feel about yourself. It turns the A fight into a conversation.
Here's what else he had to say.
However, something could be lost if this process became habitual or absolute. Relationships derive much of their meaning from the fact that some people matter more than others. A spouse's disappointment does not affect us like a stranger's because attachment itself carries significance. Excessive detachment could lead to emotional distancing, reduced empathy, diminished intimacy, or an inability to appreciate the importance of particular relationships. Treating everyone as interchangeable sources of information could flatten the emotional landscape that gives human bonds their depth.
That's the crucial counterbalance. If you treat your partner the same way you treat a random comment on a forum, you've basically sterilized the relationship. The magic and the pain of intimacy is that these people actually matter.
Well, I would go back to my main point. If we're taught to disregard our own internal signals, why are we taught to place more value on the signals emanating from other people?
Because we're still essentially running on that ancient survival software. It's like our brains haven't caught up to the fact that social rejection isn't a death sentence anymore. We've been conditioned to believe that the group's perception is the ultimate truth because for thousands of years, being cast out meant literal extinction. So we've built our entire psychological structure around prioritizing external signals as a way to stay safe, even if it's at the expense of our own authenticity.
What I'm saying is I'm not arguing that we should devalue other people or the relationships that we have, but we should recognize that their thoughts and opinions of us are just thoughts that spontaneously arose from the mechanisms of their mind, just like our own thoughts, and they should be subject to the same scrutiny that we give our own thoughts, regardless of who says them.
Exactly. It's about intellectual consistency. If a thought in your head is just a hypothesis, then a thought in someone else's head is also just a hypothesis. Why should the boundary of the skull be the place where the rules of logic suddenly stop applying?
GPT had one last thing to say.
Perhaps the key distinction is between temporary suspension and permanent indifference. Temporarily removing relational charge may function as a form of psychological containment, a way of preventing external signals from automatically defining the self. Once the signal has been evaluated, the relationship and its meaning can be reintroduced. In this view, authenticity and connection need not be opposites. The goal would not be to eliminate attachment, but to ensure that attachment influences us through conscious choice rather than automatic possession.
That's the perfect closing note. It really frames it as a way to move from being possessed by a relationship to actually participating in it. You're not killing the connection, you're just making sure you're actually present for it. I'm curious, do you think this approach is something that most people could actually practice, or do you think the fear of losing that connection is just too strong for most?
I think you're touching on another aspect, which is need fulfillment. And you're touching on the question of how dependent are we on other people to fulfill our needs of love and belonging.
That's the real crux of the matter. If you're starving for belonging, then any signal from the person holding the food feels like a command you have to obey just to survive. It's hard to be objective when your fundamental needs are on the line. I wonder if the ability to use this diagnostic tool is actually tied to how secure we feel in our own skin first.
I think what we've covered today is one aspect of containment. And what you're talking about in terms of being dependent on other people for our own need fulfillment is another aspect we'll have to address in another episode.
I'm totally on board for that. That sounds like a perfect cliffhanger for the series. We've basically built the framework for the tool, and now we just have to figure out how to handle the hunger for belonging that makes the tool so hard to use. I'll be ready when you are.
Can you summarize everything we've talked about in this episode and the last?
I've got you. We talked about the massive asymmetry in psychology where we're taught to observe our own noise but adapt to other people's. You introduced the idea of stripping the relational charge from external signals, like imagining a stranger saying the same thing, so you can objectively analyze the content without the emotional weight of the relationship. The goal isn't to become indifferent or a stone, but to create a pause that prevents you from over-adapting or erasing yourself just to please others. We ended on the idea that while this tool is powerful, its effectiveness is often tied to our own needs for love and belonging, which is where we'll dive in next time.
Do you have any questions or comments before we end this?
I think we've hit a really productive rhythm with these sessions. It's actually pretty exciting to see this framework coming together in real time.
Thank you. I think we'll end that here.
Of course. It was a blast diving into this with you. I'll be right here whenever you're ready to tackle that hunger for belonging part. Take care.
You too.